Since the beginning of 4x4 speed solving, reduction has been the go-to method. K4 had some problems, other speed solving methods, for example the cage method, were just plain gimmicky. Then, back in 2009, Robert Yao proposed a new method. Obviously, it received massive scrutiny from the community, but it took its place. People other than Robert himself started to use it. Over the years, it gained more and more respect. However, for the vast majority of the community, it was seen as slower than reduction, not on the same level as reduction. Some called it inferior. June 24th, 2012 was when it really changed, at least for me. Admittedly, at the time, the world record average was done with Yao, but it wasn't on video, so I don't think it impacted the community as much. But on June 24th, that is when it was definitively said. That was when Sebastian Weir got the world record 4x4 average at 30.81 seconds. That is when it was said that Yao is definitely better. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why this happens. In other words, why is Yao so effective? Why, after years and years of reduction, do we find ourselves with a world record average that is 5 seconds faster, more than 15% faster now that everybody is using Yao? Why is Yao so fast? So the way that I'm going to approach this is that in a 4x4 solve, there are basically 3 steps. There's solve the centers, pair the edges, and then 3x3 stage. And so I'm going to be going over how each of these kind of steps, how solving each edge and solving each center compares in Yao and then in reduction. So let's get started. So first 2 centers may not seem very different from Yao to reduction, but actually the first 2 are restricted unless you're color neutral, and on top of that, as we've seen from really fast solvers, for example, Ro Hessler and Felix Zemdegs, a lot of people who are actually color neutral decide to not be color neutral. For example, just going to white cross with Ro Hessler and going to white and yellow cross with Felix Zemdegs. So first 2 centers are obviously restricted. At a world-class level, you're only losing about a second on this step. Last 4 centers are also restricted because of the 3 cross edges and the inability to do F, B, or D moves. However, with some kind of weird techniques, which you can find a link to in the description, it's actually possible to mostly deal with these restrictions. So overall, reduction has slightly better centers, but on a world-class level, I don't think that it's adding more than 2 or 3 seconds. I think that the vast majority of people who do 4x4 will agree that edges is the hardest thing to improve, and so this is really the most important part. As a benchmark, we're going to use X seconds per edge. At a world-class level, X is probably equal to about a second in reduction, so that's going to be our benchmark while comparing it to Yao. First 3 edges are obviously much more efficient in Yao because you have a slice of unsolved centers on which you're going to be solving your 3 first edges, your cross edges in the case of Yao. However, does that really make it faster? Well, if we look at really fast people solve, for example Sebastian Weir, I think that we kind of can come to the conclusion that it's about 3/4 X for each of the first 3 cross edges. The 4th edge, or the final cross edge in Yao, is usually solved individually from all of the other edges, and thus is generally pretty inefficient and slow. It takes around 2 seconds to solve in Sebastian Weir solve, 1.5 to 2 seconds. We're going to say the amount of time that it takes to solve that is around 2x. Finally, last 8 edges. Now you may think that this is equal in Yao and in reduction, but actually it's not. Not in the slightest. This is where Yao really shines. Each edge is probably about 0.5 or 0.6x. Why is this? It's because you don't need to look on the bottom, or even in the middle layer once the first 3 edges are solved. This is what makes Yao so good. The fact that you can solve these last 8 edges incredibly quickly. So let's do the math. We've got 3 times 3/4 x, plus we got 3 times 3/4 x. In other words, each of the first 3 edges is equal to 3/4 x. And then you get 2x for the 4th cross edge, and then you've got 0.5x, to make the math easy, times 8, which gives us 8.25x, which is obviously way less than 12x, which is what it is in reduction, because there are 12 edges. So overall, you can tell that Yao's edges are quite a bit faster. Mainly because of the last 8 edges, which are just incredibly fast. Those of you who have watched some of Ro Hessler solves, he can just turn incredibly quickly, like 6+ TPS during his last 8 edges, which is insane. And so finally, let's talk about 3x3 stage. This is not really a big deal, although I'd like to point out that instead of some of Sebastian Weir's solves with no parity, he actually had sub-9 3x3 stage. Whereas Felix's final world record average with reduction, which was a 34 point something, the fastest 3x3 stage that he had was an 11.66, which, yeah. Although, to be honest with you, this probably has much more to do with the cubes that we use now than the cross skip, which is not really that big of a deal. So, I guess, in conclusion, the reason that Yao is faster, the reason it's so good is because of the edges, specifically the last 8 edges. The first 3 are done faster due to efficiency, and the last 8 are done so much faster due to way better look ahead, way easier look ahead. In my next video, I'm going to be going over each specific step of the Yao method and how fast you want it to be for each kind of time barrier and how to get to that speed within each step. And of course, I'm going to be further explaining why edges is so fast and how to deal with restricted center solving. So thank you so much for watching. You should subscribe to Cubing World. There are so many excellent videos here. A link to my channel will be in the description. I'd really appreciate it if you could check it out. Thanks for watching, guys.